Richard Cole sat in the middle of his grand dining hall, a room that could easily fit 100 guests. Yet the only sound echoing off the marble walls was the quiet ticking of an antique clock. The long, polished oak table stretched endlessly in front of him, covered in expensive silverware and a perfectly prepared meal that remained untouched. Chandeliers sparkled above, casting golden light across the room, but no amount of brightness could erase the heavy gloom that pressed against Richard's chest. On paper, he had everything a man could want. He was a millionaire, self-made, respected in the business world, and admired for his sharp mind. He had climbed from poverty to power through relentless work and sacrifice. His mansion stood on a hill overlooking the city, a glass fortress that people admired from a distance. His cars, his art collection, and his investments were worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Yet, despite all of this, Richard sat slumped at the head of the table, staring at the steam rising from a bowl of soup he hadn't touched. Because the truth was simple, he was alone. 2 years earlier, tragedy had shattered his world. His wife, the love of his life, had died in a sudden car accident on a rainy night. The shock had nearly broken him. Their only daughter, Emily, devastated by the loss of her mother, chose to leave for college abroad sooner than expected. She said the house was too painful to live in, too full of memories that cut deep. Richard couldn't blame her, but her absence left him completely alone in the giant house. At first, Richard thought money would be a distraction. He threw himself into work harder than ever. He bought new companies, made bigger deals, and filled his home with luxury. He believed if he surrounded himself with enough wealth, he could bury the pain. But the truth only became clearer. Money could fill his bank account, but not the empty seat across from him at dinner. That night, as he pushed the soup away, Richard whispered to himself, "I have everything, and yet I have nothing." His voice cracked, and the sound echoed through the empty room like a cruel reminder. Unable to sit still any longer, Richard stood up and grabbed his coat. The silence of the mansion was suffocating, so he decided to take a walk through the city. Sometimes, wandering the streets at night gave him a strange comfort. It reminded him of the years before he became rich, when life was hard but never lonely. The cold air bit at his skin as he walked past glowing restaurants and busy cafes. People laughed inside, clinking glasses and sharing meals. Richard shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets, wondering when he had last laughed like that, when he had last felt alive. He didn't realize how far he had walked until he reached a quieter part of town. The lights grew dimmer, the shops fewer, the roads cracked and uneven. That was when he saw them, two small figures huddled together in the corner of an alley near a bakery that had already closed for the night. Richard slowed his steps, squinting in disbelief. A boy, no older than 8, sat shivering under a torn blanket, holding a smaller girl close to his chest. Her head rested on his shoulder, her tiny hands clutching the boy's arm as though it were her only anchor in the world. Their clothes were worn thin, their shoes mismatched, and their faces pale from hunger and cold. Richard's heart clenched. He had seen poverty before, but something about this sight stopped him in his tracks. Maybe it was the boy's protective grip around his sister. Maybe it was the way the girl reminded him of Emily when she was small, or maybe it was the way both children looked too familiar with suffering. For the first time in years, Richard felt something stir inside him, an ache that wasn't for himself, but for someone else. And that was the beginning of a night that would change his life forever. Richard stood frozen at the edge of the alley, his breath clouding in the frosty air. The sight of the two children was like a knife twisting in his chest. He had been on his way to escape his own loneliness, yet here were two little souls fighting for warmth in the biting cold. He hesitated, unsure whether to step forward. Wealth had built a wall around him over the years. He wasn't used to approaching strangers anymore, let alone children who clearly lived on the streets. But something inside urged him, "Don't walk away this time." He took a cautious step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The boy noticed first. His eyes, wide and dark, snapped open with alertness. Instinctively, he pulled his sister closer and wrapped his arms tighter around her. Though trembling, the boy tried to appear strong, like a small guardian standing between his sister and the world. "Hey," Richard said softly, keeping his voice calm, almost fatherly. "Are you two all right?" The boy's jaw tightened. He looked up at Richard with a mix of suspicion and bravery that startled him. "Oh, we're fine, sir," the boy answered, his voice hoarse, as if every word cost him effort. The little girl stirred, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She peeked at Richard, then quickly buried her face against her brother's chest. Richard noticed how thin she was, how her small frame shook even under the blanket. His heart ached deeper. Then, before Richard could speak again, the boy slowly stretched out his hand. Resting in his tiny palm was half a piece of bread, stale and dry. He pushed it forward with a trembling arm. "It's all I have," the boy whispered. His lips quivered, but his eyes didn't waver. But we can share. The world seemed to stop spinning for Richard in that moment. His chest tightened so hard he thought he might collapse. A millionaire, dressed in expensive clothes, carrying a wallet thick with credit cards, was being offered food by a child who had almost nothing. Richard crouched down so he was at the boy's level, his knees pressing into the cold ground. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat was thick with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Finally, he managed, "No, son, you keep it. You need it more than I do." But the boy shook his head stubbornly. "Mama always said, 'Sharing makes us rich in here,'" he said, tapping his small chest. Those words struck Richard harder than any deal he had ever made, harder than any loss he had endured. A child who had lost everything still carried wisdom that most adults never understood. Richard felt tears burn in his eyes, tears he thought he had buried the day his wife died. He reached out slowly, not to take the bread, but to gently rest his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your mama was a very wise woman," Richard whispered. For a long moment, none of them moved. The city around them carried on, cars passed, lights flickered. But in that alley, it was just the three of them, bound by an invisible thread of humanity. Finally, Richard stood up and cleared his throat. "Come with me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let's get you both something warm to eat. Real food, not just scraps." The boy hesitated, glancing at his sister, who looked at him with sleepy, trusting eyes. She nodded faintly, as if even in her weakness she wanted to follow. Slowly, the boy rose, still holding her hand. Richard smiled softly, stretching out his hand. At first, the boy didn't take it. Pride and caution flickered across his face. But then, with a deep breath, he placed his small hand into Richard's. It was a simple touch, but for Richard, it felt like holding on to life itself. Don't let this story end here. Let it continue in homes and hearts and in conversations. Hit subscribe, give it a like, and share it forward. You never know how far one story can travel. The little bakery at the end of the street still glowed faintly with its last lamp burning. Though the sign on the door read "Closed," Richard knocked firmly, his breath fogging in the frosty air. An elderly baker, half asleep and surprised, peeked out from the side door. His eyes softened the moment he saw the children clinging to Richard's coat. "Please," Richard said quietly, almost pleading. "Anything hot you have left. Soup, bread, whatever you can manage." The baker, though tired, opened the door wider and welcomed them inside. The warmth of the bakery wrapped around them like a blanket, the sweet smell of freshly baked bread making the little girl's eyes widen. Her stomach growled audibly, and Richard noticed the boy's embarrassed glance downward. He guided them gently to a corner table, pulling out chairs as if they were honored guests. The baker soon returned with bowls of steaming vegetable soup, thick slices of bread, and 2 mugs of warm milk. The children stared at the feast in disbelief. For them, it was not just food, it was a miracle. But instead of diving in, the boy did something that froze Richard's heart. He carefully pushed one of the bowls toward him. "You should eat too, sir," the boy said earnestly. "We said we'd share." Richard stared at the bowl, his vision blurring with tears. This child who had nothing, who had spent nights in the cold and days hungry, was still thinking of him. Him, a man with wealth beyond measure, who had dined in the most luxurious restaurants in the world, who could buy anything he desired. Yet, here he was, being offered soup by a boy who considered it treasure. Richard forced a shaky smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. He picked up the spoon, though he had no hunger. He took a slow sip, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to honor the boy's gift. The warmth of the soup spread through him, not just in his body, but in his soul. The little girl, encouraged by her brother, dipped her bread into the soup and giggled softly as the taste filled her mouth. Richard hadn't heard a child's giggle in his home for years. The sound struck him like sunlight breaking through clouds. He found himself laughing too, a deep, rusty laugh he had forgotten he was capable of. The baker, watching from behind the counter, shook his head in quiet wonder. To him, it seemed like an ordinary meal, but to Richard it was extraordinary. As they ate, Richard leaned down. "What's your name, son?" The boy swallowed his bread before answering. "I'm Daniel, and this is my sister, Lily." "Daniel and Lily," Richard repeated softly, tasting the names like a prayer. He smiled at them warmly. "Beautiful names." Lily looked up shyly. "What's your name, mister?" "Richard," he said, smiling at her. "Uncle Richard," Daniel corrected quickly, his face lighting with a playful grin. "You feel like an uncle." Richard's chest tightened again. He hadn't felt like family to anyone in so long. He nodded slowly, trying to hold back the flood of emotion threatening to spill. "All right then, Uncle Richard." For the next half hour they ate together. Daniel spoke about how he took care of Lily, how they found empty corners of the city to sleep in, how sometimes kind strangers gave them scraps. He didn't complain. He spoke with a quiet pride, as though protecting his sister was his life's mission. Richard listened, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He realized something with painful clarity. These children had less than anyone he had ever met, yet they were richer in love than he had been in years. When the bowls were finally empty and their bellies full, Daniel leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly. "Thank you, Uncle Richard," he said softly. "But remember, we still shared." Richard swallowed hard, his vision blurring again. He reached across the table and took Daniel's small hand in his own. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling, "and I'll never forget it." That night, in the warmth of the bakery, Richard realized that a child's simple offer had just begun to change his entire life. When the meal was finished, Richard sat quietly, watching Daniel and Lily lick the last traces of soup from their spoons. Their eyes sparkled with a simple joy that struck him deeply. For them, it was not just dinner, it was warmth, safety, and love wrapped in a bowl of soup and bread. Richard leaned back in his chair, taking in the scene. He had eaten in some of the finest restaurants across the world. The five-star French cuisine in Paris, candlelit dinners overlooking the canals in Venice, grand banquets hosted by billionaires. Yet none of those meals had ever touched him like this one. Watching Daniel carefully wipe Lily's mouth with the corner of the blanket, seeing the way she giggled at his clumsy attempts, Richard realized he was witnessing something money could never buy. When Lily caught him staring, she tilted her head curiously. "Uncle Richard, why aren't you eating more?" Richard smiled softly, his voice low. "Because I'm full, sweetheart. Not in my stomach, but here." He pressed his palm against his chest. "Full in my heart." Lily's innocent face brightened, though she didn't quite understand. Daniel, however, gave him a small, knowing nod. It was the same nod his wife used to give him when words weren't needed. That tiny gesture nearly undid him. Richard cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "How long have you two been out here like this?" Daniel shrugged a little too casually. "Since Mama went to heaven. Papa left before that. We've been okay. I take care of Lily." Richard froze. The weight of those words crashed over him. Their mother was gone, their father had abandoned them, and here was this child, this boy of barely 8, shouldering a burden no child should ever carry. The image of his own daughter, Emily, at that same age, flashed before his eyes. She had been tucked safely into bed every night, her mother kissing her forehead while he read her bedtime stories. The thought of her alone on the streets made his chest ache unbearably. Lily tugged at Richard's sleeve, her small voice breaking his thoughts. "Are you going to leave us, too?" The question sliced him open. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He thought of all the times Emily had begged him not to leave for work trips, how he had brushed her off, telling her he was doing it all for her. Yet, in truth, he had been chasing money more than moments, and in chasing money, he had lost the chance to hold on to the people who mattered most. "No," Richard said finally, his voice firm, though it shook with emotion. He leaned closer, making sure they could see the truth in his eyes. "I won't leave you. Not tonight. Not ever, if I can help it." Daniel studied him as if weighing his soul. Then slowly he nodded. Mama said people always leave," he whispered, almost to himself. "But maybe you're different." Richard's heart ached, but this time it was with determination. He knew in that moment he could not simply walk away from these children. The baker returned quietly, placing a small paper bag filled with extra rolls on the table. "For the little ones," he said with a warm smile. Richard slipped the man a generous tip, but the baker shook his head. "Sir, with respect, I saw what just happened here tonight. That boy gave you half of his bread. Money isn't what he needs. Keep your wallet for them." The words humbled Richard further. He placed the money back in his pocket and nodded gratefully. As they left the bakery, Daniel's small hand slipped into Richard's again. Lily clung to his other hand, her tiny steps quickening to keep up. The night was still cold, the street still empty, but something had changed. Richard no longer felt the icy wind cutting into his bones. For the first time in years, warmth radiated from the simplest thing. 2 little hands, trusting him to lead them. When they reached his car, Daniel gasped. "This is yours?" he asked, eyes wide at the sleek black luxury vehicle. Richard chuckled softly. "Yes, but tonight it's ours. All of us." He opened the back seat and gently helped them inside, wrapping the blanket tighter around them. As he started the engine, Richard glanced in the rearview mirror. Daniel leaned against the window exhausted, but smiling faintly. Lily curled into her brother's lap, already drifting into sleep. Richard whispered to himself, his voice breaking but filled with new resolve. This meal, it changed everything. The drive back to Richard's mansion was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sighs of the sleeping children in the back seat. Richard stole glances at them through the rearview mirror. Daniel's small hand protectively resting on Lily's shoulder, Lily's head nestled against her brother's chest. Even in sleep, they clung to each other as though letting go would mean losing the only family they had left. By the time they reached the sprawling gates of his estate, Richard hesitated. Would this place, this cold monument of wealth, feel like a home to children who had grown used to nothing but the streets? Still, he pressed the button and the gates slowly swung open. The car rolled up the driveway, the headlights illuminating polished stone and manicured gardens. Daniel stirred first. His eyes opened and his expression shifted from confusion to shock as he sat up straighter. "This is where you live?" Richard nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, and tonight it's where you'll sleep too." Lily awoke with a yawn, blinking at the mansion in disbelief. "It's like a castle," she whispered, rubbing her eyes. Richard carried Lily in his arms while Daniel walked close by, his small hands brushing against the gleaming walls as they entered. The children gazed at the crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the endless hallways filled with paintings and sculptures. To Richard, these were objects he'd bought to fill a void. To the children, they were treasures from another world. He guided them to a guest bedroom. The bed was larger than anything they had ever seen, piled with soft blankets. Lily climbed onto it instantly, bouncing gently, her laughter echoing down the hall. Daniel, however, stood at the doorway, frowning slightly. "It's so big," he murmured, "but it feels empty." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He froze in place, remembering the countless nights he had eaten alone in the dining hall, the silence that haunted every corner of this mansion. Daniel had spoken the truth without even realizing it. A house without love was just a shell, no matter how beautiful. Richard knelt down so he could meet Daniel's eyes. "You're right," he admitted softly. "It has felt empty for a very long time, but maybe you and Lily can help me change that." Daniel studied him for a long moment, as if testing whether to believe him. Finally, he gave a small nod and stepped inside. Richard tucked Lily in, pulling the covers up to her chin. She reached out sleepily and grabbed his hand. "Don't go, Uncle Richard," she whispered. His chest tightened, and for a second, he was back in time. Hearing Emily's little voice saying the same words years ago, he had left so many nights, chasing late meetings and business trips, telling himself he was building a future for her. But in reality, he had been leaving her lonely. This time, Richard sat at the edge of the bed and promised, "I'm not going anywhere." Lily smiled faintly, drifting back into sleep. Later, when Daniel sat with him in the living room, Richard asked gently, "Can you tell me more about your parents?" Daniel stared at the floor, his small hands tightening into fists. "Mama, she got sick. We couldn't help her. One day she just didn't wake up." His voice cracked, but he pressed on bravely. "Papa said he was going to find work, but he never came back. Maybe he's gone forever." Richard felt his throat close. He reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, steady and warm. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." Daniel's eyes glistened, but he blinked quickly, refusing to cry. "I promised Mama I'd take care of Lily. That's what I've been doing." Richard's chest ached with admiration and sorrow. This boy carried more courage and responsibility than most men he knew. "You've done more than most adults ever could," Richard said softly. "I bet you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Daniel looked up at him with cautious hope. "You really won't leave us?" Richard shook his head firmly. "Not now. Not ever." For the first time, Daniel's guarded expression broke. His lips trembled, and before he could stop himself, he leaned into Richard's arms. Richard held him tightly, feeling the boy's small frame shake as silent tears finally fell. In that moment, Richard understood the painful truth. Not just about the children, but about himself. They needed someone to stay. And he, for all his wealth and emptiness, needed someone to stay with him too. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Richard's mansion. It painted golden patterns across the marble floor, but what truly made the house feel alive was the sound. Giggles, footsteps, and voices. For years, Richard had woken to silence, broken only by the hum of machines and the faint rustle of staff tidying rooms. But that morning, laughter bounced down the hallways, and the emptiness he had grown used to felt like it was finally being replaced. Richard followed the sound and found Daniel and Lily in the kitchen. Lily sat on the counter, swinging her legs happily, while Daniel stood on a stool, trying to pour milk into 2 bowls of cereal. A housekeeper hovered nearby, looking nervous, as though unsure whether the children were allowed in such a pristine space. Richard smiled warmly. "Let them be," he told the staff member. "This is their home now, too." Daniel turned, startled. "Uncle Richard!" "We made breakfast." Richard chuckled at the sight of spilled milk dripping onto the counter. "Looks delicious," he said sincerely, pulling up a chair. Lily proudly handed him a spoon, her face glowing with excitement. For the first time in years, Richard sat at a breakfast table that wasn't silent. Daniel chattered about the bakery from the night before, about how warm the soup was, about how soft the bed had been. Lily interrupted with giggles, telling silly little stories about how Daniel always snored, or how she once found a puppy in the street and named it Mr. Wiggles. Richard listened intently, laughing along, feeling his heart swell with something he had almost forgotten: joy. Later that day, Richard gave the children a tour of the mansion. Lily gasped at the library, her little fingers brushing the spines of books taller than her. Daniel was fascinated by the garden, especially the fountain that sparkled in the sunlight. Yet, despite their awe, they both returned often to Richard's side, as though afraid he might vanish if they let him out of their sight. At one point, Daniel looked up at him seriously. "Uncle Richard, do you get lonely here?" The question caught him off guard. He glanced around at the glittering chandeliers, the vast hallways, the endless rooms. "Yes," he admitted honestly. "Very lonely." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, then reached out and took his hand. "Not anymore. We're here now." Those words, simple, innocent, and true, hit Richard harder than any business deal or award ever had. He squeezed the boy's hand gently, his throat tightening with gratitude. Over the next few weeks, the bond between them grew stronger. Richard enrolled them in school, bought them clothes, and made sure their days were filled with warmth and stability. But more importantly, he spent time with them. He sat at the table while they did homework, read bedtime stories to Lily, and listened to Daniel talk about his dreams of becoming a doctor someday. In return, the children gave him something money had never been able to buy: companionship. Daniel began to smile more, no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. Lily skipped through the halls singing little songs, her laughter filling the mansion with life. And Richard? He found himself waking up eager for the day, eager to hear their voices again. One evening, they all sat together watching an old family movie. Lily curled into his lap, while Daniel leaned against his arm. As the screen flickered, Richard felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of belonging. He realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't a man surrounded by empty wealth. He was part of a family again. Yet, even in this newfound happiness, Richard carried a quiet fear. He knew that keeping the children wasn't as simple as opening his doors. There were laws, procedures, and questions to answer, but deep in his heart, he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't imagine life without them anymore. They had given him back his laughter, his purpose, his humanity, and he would do whatever it took to make sure they never had to face the cold streets again. Section 7. A decision that shocked everyone. 650 words. The days turned into weeks, and what had started as an act of kindness slowly transformed into something deeper. Richard had opened his mansion to Daniel and Lily, but soon it wasn't just a temporary arrangement. It was a new way of living. The staff, who once kept their distance from the lonely millionaire, began warming up too. They watched how Richard softened when Lily tugged at his sleeve, or when Daniel proudly showed him a school project. Even the gardeners noticed the difference. Richard spent more time in the garden with the children than in his office. The mansion, once a place of silence and shadows, now buzzed with life. But not everyone saw it that way. At a business dinner one evening, Richard's longtime associates began whispering, "Have you heard? Richard Hayes has taken in 2 children. From the streets, apparently. A man of his stature, associating with orphans. It's bound to cause a scandal." Richard overheard every word, but he didn't care. Their judgment no longer held power over him. That night, as Daniel and Lily sat cross-legged on his study floor, playing with puzzles, Richard made a decision that would shock everyone around him. He cleared his throat and called them closer. "Daniel, Lily," he began gently, his voice unsteady with emotion, "I want to ask you something important." The children looked up, wide-eyed. "What is it, Uncle Richard?" Lily asked, clutching her toy rabbit. Richard knelt down to their level, his heart pounding. "How would you feel if I became your father?" The room fell silent for a moment. Daniel's eyes widened, and then tears welled up in them. "You mean you'd adopt us?" Richard nodded. "Yes, if you'll let me. I don't want you to ever worry about being alone again. You deserve love, safety, and a family. And I want to give that to you for the rest of my life." For a heartbeat, neither child spoke. Then Lily launched herself into his arms, giggling and crying at the same time. "Daddy Richard," she squealed. Daniel, though older and more cautious, placed his hand on Richard's shoulder. His voice trembled as he whispered, I'd love that. More than anything. Richard held them tightly, overwhelmed with emotions he could hardly put into words. For years, his fortune had given him everything except the one thing he longed for: a family. And now, with two small voices calling him Daddy, he felt richer than ever. The very next morning, Richard called his lawyer. He set the adoption process in motion, despite the raised eyebrows it caused in social and business circles. Some claimed he was being reckless, that orphans could never fit into the world of the elite. But Richard silenced them with one firm declaration. These children have given me something no money could buy: love and purpose. I will not let anyone take that away. News outlets soon caught wind of the story. Headlines splashed across papers. Millionaire businessman chooses love over legacy. Richard Hayes to adopt orphaned siblings. The public reaction was mixed. Some praised him as a hero, a man of compassion in a world obsessed with wealth. Others mocked him, calling it a publicity stunt. But those closest to Richard knew the truth. It wasn't about headlines. It was about healing wounds, both his and the children's. Through the long, complicated legal process, Richard remained steady. He attended every hearing, answered every question, and fought every obstacle. Daniel and Lily clung to him through it all, never doubting that he truly wanted them. Finally, after months of waiting, the judge delivered the decision. Richard Hayes was officially their legal guardian. When the gavel struck, Richard felt a lump in his throat. Daniel grabbed his hand tightly, and Lily squealed with joy, hugging his neck. For Richard, it was more than just a legal victory. It was the moment his life truly began again. He walked out of that courtroom not as a lonely millionaire, but as a father. And though the world might never fully understand his choice, Richard didn't care. For him, this was the most important decision of his life, and the only one that truly mattered. The courtroom decision was just the start. Walking out that day with Daniel holding his left hand and Lily skipping along on his right, Richard felt as though he had stepped into an entirely new chapter of his life. For years he had walked alone, weighed down by grief and emptiness, but now, for the first time, he walked as a father, with children who saw him not as a millionaire, not as a businessman, but simply as someone who loved them. That evening, back at the mansion, a quiet celebration unfolded. The staff, who had once been stiff and distant, brought out a cake decorated with the words, "Welcome home, family." Lily clapped her hands in delight while Daniel smiled shyly, clearly touched. Richard made a small speech, his voice trembling. "I've signed many contracts in my life, made deals worth millions, but today I signed the most important paper of all. Because it didn't just give me 2 children, it gave me back my life." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the butler, who had served Richard for decades, discreetly wiped a tear. From that day onward, life changed in ways big and small. The once silent halls of the mansion echoed with laughter, footsteps, and conversations. Richard no longer dined alone at the long table. Instead, the 3 of them ate together, often squished into one end, sharing stories of their day. Daniel, now confident and hopeful, thrived at school. He loved science and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Richard, who had always valued ambition, encouraged him at every step, promising to support his education wherever it might lead. Lily, with her endless energy and imagination, filled the house with drawings, songs, and silly dances. She had a way of making everyone smile, even on the hardest days. But perhaps the greatest transformation was in Richard himself. No longer did he bury himself in work or isolate in his office. Instead, he spent evenings helping with homework, attending school plays, or reading bedtime stories. The walls he had built around his heart slowly crumbled, replaced by warmth, love, and laughter. One Sunday morning, as they ate pancakes together in the kitchen, Daniel suddenly looked up and asked, "Dad, are you happy now?" Richard paused, looking at his son. For a moment, memories of his old life flashed before him. The loneliness, the nights staring out of tall windows at the world he felt cut off from. And then he looked at Daniel, at Lily grinning with syrup on her cheeks, and he smiled. "Happier than I've ever been," he answered softly. The children exchanged a proud look, as if they had been the ones to heal him. And in truth, they had. Months later, the family visited the same bakery where it all began. The baker, recognizing them instantly, came out from behind the counter with tears in his eyes. "So this is where life has brought you," he said warmly. Richard nodded, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "This is my family now." Lily tugged at the baker's apron. "Do you still have the soup?" she asked, her big eyes hopeful. The baker laughed heartily. "For you, little one, always." As they sat together eating bowls of warm soup, Richard realized the beauty of the full circle. What had started with a simple act of sharing food had blossomed into something life-changing. In the years that followed, Richard's story spread far and wide. Not because he was a millionaire, but because he had chosen love when he could have turned away. He became known not just for his business empire, but for the legacy of kindness and compassion he had built. But for Richard, the true reward wasn't in headlines or praise. It was in the sound of Lily's laughter echoing down the halls. It was in the way Daniel hugged him goodnight without hesitation. It was in the simple joy of being needed, of belonging, of knowing that at last he wasn't alone. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Richard sat with Daniel and Lily beside the fountain. The children leaned against him, their eyes heavy with sleep. Looking at them, Richard whispered softly to himself, This is all I ever wanted." And in that moment, surrounded by the family he had once thought he'd never have, Richard Hayes, the heartbroken millionaire, finally found his happy ending. Don't let this story end here. Let it continue in homes and hearts and in conversations. Hit subscribe, give it a like, and share it forward. You never know how far one story can travel.